So today we are joined by two teams that are heading up what we're calling our Axis 1 knowledge synthesis work. They're coming to us from Stanford University and from Rhodes University, and they'll be discussing the theoretical, the methodological, and logistical considerations that are related to carrying out various types of literature reviews, which has a lot of applications for our work in Axis 1, but much broader application beyond the MECCE work, which I think is perhaps why many of you have been interested to joining us today. Just in terms of a few housekeeping items, we are recording the webinar so that we can share with our team members around the world who can't be here today. We're managing lots of different time zones. Throughout the webinar, if you wouldn't mind keeping your microphones muted, we later, if the bandwidth starts to show some struggling, we'd like also to ask, feel free to mute your videos so that we can preserve that bandwidth. In terms of how we'll run today, each of our two teams of speakers will each present for about 15 minutes. And then we'll move into a Q&A, and you can feel free to put your Q&A in the chat box, which for some of you might be at the top, some of you might be at the bottom of your screen. We'd like to make this as engaging as possible, but also manageable on Zoom. So when we do get the Q&A, if you feel comfortable, I'll call on you and you can even speak your question to the panelists. So I'm going to briefly introduce our speakers, and then we'll turn the mic over. So our first group of speakers come to us from Stanford University. We have Nicole Ardoin, who is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education and the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford University. She's also the Emmett Family Faculty Scholar and the director of the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources in the School of Earth, Energy, and Environmental Sciences. Nicole is leading the Axis 1 knowledge synthesis work on interdisciplinary understandings of quality climate change education. And she's also joined by her colleague Alison Bowers, who is a research associate with us on this Axis 1 knowledge synthesis work. And she's also a research associate at the Stanford Social Ecology Lab with Nicole. And then our second group of presenters is Heila Lotz-Sisitka. She's a distinguished research professor at Rhodes University. She also holds a Tier 1 South African National Research Foundation Department of Science and Technology Chair in Global Change and Social Learning Systems. Heila is leading our Axis 1 knowledge synthesis work on regional and cultural considerations as they relate to quality climate change education and communications. And joining her will be Ludwig Chanyau, who is a research assistant with us on this work, and with Heila. He is a doctoral student at Rhodes University in the Environmental Learning and Research Center. So without any further ado, we are right on time. We're going to go over to Alison, who will kick us off with her screen share and her presentation. Thank you so much, Alison.
Perfect. Thank you, Christina. And Nicole, if Nicole was having audio issues, if you're able to join, did you want to jump in real quick and intro, or do you want me to head straight into the slides?
If you can hear me, I am here now. Sorry about that. I was having a little bit of sound issues, but I don't need to say much. Just thanks so much for having us, and we're delighted to be here. And Alison, thank you for putting together this talk, and excited to hear what you have to share with us today. So that's it.
Perfect. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Thank you. So thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Christina and Marcia. Thanks for having us. And we're going to keep this pretty informal. I love talking about literature reviews. So Christina has promised to cut me off if I go too long. But basically, it's going to be a very broad overview, talking about literature reviews, transitioning a little bit specifically to systematic reviews, and then kind of summing up with an overview of what we're planning for this project. So that's first question was kind of an overview. Why review the literature in the first place? If any of you have done official reviews, you know they're time intensive, they're resource intensive. So why even do them? And I think people look at lit reviews usually in a historical way, right? That we're looking at the past. What do we already know? What does the research tell us? What have people already found? And so they look at it as a very historical exercise, but I like to think that it also impacts the present and the future. You can look at what we've already done to inform what we do now, whether that be practice or intervention or other research. Particularly with research, how can you tie into what's already known? And a lit review would tell you that. Unless you're doing like a replication study, then you definitely don't want to be like doing something that 10 people have already done. And so lit review can kind of point that out and help you figure that out. It's also good at helping you plan for the future. What are the gaps in the research? What controversies are there? What areas has no one really dug into deeply? And so really by looking at the past, it's like looking at history, right? It can inform what you're doing today and what you're doing in the future. So when people think of lit review, they often think of kind of a traditional lit review that can be done in a haphazard way. And this is something I think a lot of us do, right? When we're writing a proposal, when we're writing a journal article, perhaps even for dissertation level work, it may be haphazard. You're just trying to look at a field broadly. You may go down one rabbit hole here and one rabbit hole there. You may go based off of a few key terms you type into Google Scholar, something your advisor says you need to include this person in your lit review. So it can seem very haphazard. And there's value in that, I think. There is something to say for creativity, and that kind of searching helps spark creativity and inspiration and passion and interest. So those are very valuable. But there's also reasons to do it in a more structured way. And the main reason, I think, is just this tremendous growth we've seen in scholarly research. And the image I have here is of the STM report. And I wanted to share this resource because it's fantastic if you ever have to provide like figures or numbers about scholarly research. This report is good. It's from the Trade Association of Academic Publishers, and it shares little tidbits like there are about 3 million English language journal articles published in a year. For a long time, there was a growth of about 2 to 3%, but in the past couple years, that rate of growth has grown to about 4%, so even more literature. China just overtook the US in terms of top producer of research papers. So it's China, US now, India, Germany, UK, and Japan for being the most produced research. So that report I just wanted to share, that's like, I find it fascinating. So you can dig into that too. But it really does just show that, 25 years ago, if you read the top journals in your field, you could kind of keep up, but now that's becoming much more difficult. And so reviews and in a structured way really help you make sure you're covering as much literature as possible. A structured way will also potentially reduce bias. Now there are some reviews, sometimes critical reviews, where bias is a good thing, and they're looking to the expert who knows the field really well to give kind of their biased in a positive way view of the literature. But if you're, many other reviews prefer to just try to be as objective as possible. And that can be done by having, a team approach and by following a prescribed set of steps to do the review. And as we'll talk later, there's just so many decisions you have to make when doing a literature review. And so having a prescribed set of steps and doing it in a structured way just simply simplifies this decision-making for you. So sometimes when people say, oh, we're going to do a systematic review, and they seem almost intimidated. And the way I see it is it's really conducting a literature review or a systematic review. It's really just like any other type of research. So if you know how to do good research, you already know how to do a literature review. And you're really all following just the conventional research steps. First one, you plan. You're identifying your topic and research question, and then based on that, you choose a complementary design. Then you go do the research. The difference here is when you're collecting your data, it's not people, it's not experiments. Your data is actually existing literature. Then you go and you analyze the data, and then it's time to share. You write your report, your article, and if you're taking an action-oriented approach, you take action based on what you find. So it's really not as complicated or intimidating as it seems. There are lots of review methods, which can be intimidating, because how do you know which one to pick? And here, these names are just a smattering of some of the reviews that are available. I mean, there's theoretical reviews, there's umbrella reviews, which is reviews of reviews. There's targeted reviews. A lot of folks have heard of meta-analysis and meta-synthesis. So there's all kind of tools, all kind of methods, methodologies, all different kind of approaches. And so that can be overwhelming. But I always say, look at two things when deciding what type of reviews to do. One is your purpose, and your purpose involves your audience and your topic and what you want your output to be. And so by being clear on that, that can help decide what type of review to do. But then you also have to be practical. There's, as I said, these can be really resource intensive. So you have to know, what are your resources? What's your funding? What's your timeline? Are you involving an advisory board? Are you not? That kind of thing. So by knowing purpose and resources, you can really help narrow in on what type of review to do. So as I said, lots of reviews, and I'm going to focus specifically on systematic reviews. And in parallel, there are also, excuse me, many ways to do systematic reviews. A lot of people are familiar with systematic reviews, kind of where they started were in the medical and health fields. And so there they were often reviewing RCTs, which are randomized controlled trials. And that's when you were interested in like health interventions or a drug, trying to figure out what a new drug, is it effective, what's its efficacy? And so you do these RCTs, and they would do a lot of them across many different places, and the systematic review would bring all those together, and usually using meta-analysis would say, okay, this is what the research says. It is effective, it isn't, or it's effective with this group, but not that group. I come from more of a social science and education background, so I take more of a social science approach to systematic reviews. And the two definitions I share here are from social scientists and educators. Systematic reviews are a review of research literature using systematic and explicit accountable methods. And a systematic review focuses on empirical studies and seeks to summarize past research by drawing overall conclusions from many separate investigations that address related or identical hypotheses. So I kind of use those definitions to shape the way I think about systematic reviews. And if you're playing like a word association games, this is what pops up for me when I think systematic reviews. They're standardized, explicit, transparent, and accountable. And for me, these are kind of the defining features. The difference between like a systematic review and a traditional review you might do for a quick paper or proposal is that you're keeping track of your steps. You're systematically recording what you're doing you're following a set of prescribed steps. And this was done in the beginning because they wanted them to be updatable and replicable. I always give the caveat though, when we say replicable, it's not that someone could take your exact steps and your exact process and get your same results. Because at least in the social sciences, there's still subjectivity involved. You can type in search terms in a database one day, and then a week later, type in the exact same search terms and get different results because the algorithm has changed, the database itself has changed. So when we say replicable, it's not that you get the exact same thing, it's that someone could follow your process. And when someone asks me to kind of define a systematic review, I always give a really like definition. Your teachers always said, don't use the word in it. But to me, this recursive definition works. A systematic review is a review that's systematic. And that's the emphasis, is systematic's the best word for it. You are systematically following steps, recording it so that others can see what you're doing and to be efficient in your review of the literature. Just as there's many different literature reviews, there's many different types of systematic review approaches and tools and processes. On this screen, you'll see Cochrane and Joanna Briggs Institute mentioned. They are again from the medical and health fields. My early training in systematic review, I did a class at Johns Hopkins Medical School, so it did come from kind of a medical background. And then as I applied it more to social sciences, my two guidebooks are the ones here, the Research Synthesis and Meta-Analysis and an Introduction to Systematic Reviews, which have a more social science lens to systematic reviews. And they outline every step of the way, how to do it, kind of thing. So they're great resources. And also shared here is Prisma, which is a group of researchers that were wanted to come up with protocols and a standardized way of presenting systematic review results. And I use a lot of their tools and templates in the systematic reviews that we've done in the lab. And so, again, thinking that a systematic review follows any other steps of research and using a kind of a social science steps, I wanted to use the review we're doing for this project as kind of an example. And these are kind of the traditional 8 steps I follow. The first for this review, where we're kind of still in, is figuring out the identification of the topic and research questions. And one of our other team members was saying, oh, this is such a messy stage. I was like, it gets better, sort of. But if you put the work in the beginning, it makes the other steps go so just better. So it's worth spending the time in this messy area of identifying the topic and research questions to really outline the other steps. So that's what we're working on, and we're figuring out, we know it's a review of the psychosocial factors of climate change in action, figuring out what those mean. What does psychosocial mean? What is climate change in action? And so working with all our stakeholders to kind of figure those out and what our specific research question is. At the same time, we've launched into the scoping search, and scoping reviews can be reviews in and of themselves. You will see published scoping reviews. And what they are just kind of preliminary searches to see what the literature looks like to help you define your topic and your research question. And so that's the stage we're in now. But the scoping search helps you identify your protocol, your search stage. And in this review, we're thinking at this stage that we'll be using academic databases. I tend to use more than one. We've traditionally been using EBSCOhost in the lab and kind of expanding that as research says, hey, it's good to have another database as well, such as Web of Science, Scopus, that sometimes they will miss things or have things that you missed in the other ones. We may also look at the works cited list of the articles we find to find other, and that'll help us build our review sample. And then in the next step, you're going to screen. So you may end up with 4,000 citations in your search. And in the screening step, you'll narrow that down to what's really relevant. And some of the tools we use are Zotero, which is a citation manager, and Providence. It's a new tool we're using that's used in the medical field for systematic reviews, and we're exploring how that might work in this review. So you screen. So let's say you start with 4,000 citations, and now you're down to a sample of maybe 100 studies. The next step is to just extract your data. And in our lab, we've used In Vivo to do that, the qualitative analysis software. And Providence also has some analysis tools, some extraction tools to help you do that. It's useful, particularly when you have a team, to make sure everyone's got some reliability and it's easy to report those metrics. Once you've extracted your data, you're analyzing it. For this review, we're thinking thematic analysis along with some content analysis that can often kind of vary depending on what you find, what kind of data you get. And then the final steps are to just write it all up and then share and take action. So since this is part of a bigger project, those steps will kind of take care of themselves in terms of sharing. And it sounds like, from what I understand, the action will be informing the other parts of this review. So I kind of just wanted to wrap up and say, I talked a lot about it being systematic, right? And saying that you follow the prescribed steps. But at the same time, I think when I gave the example, it may have seemed kind of wishy-washy, right? And that's something I do on purpose. My training, I had a lot of training in mixed methods. I like multiple methods. And I thought that's just what good research is, right? Being open to the different methods that would work best for your problem. And so I bring that to systematic reviews that, yes, they're systematic. Yes, you're following a set of steps. But at the same time, you've got to be flexible, right? You may find certain literature that you weren't expecting to find, or you may not find the data you were thinking and have to adjust your analysis methods. You may have to be open to different databases or going even beyond database searching, even doing what's called serendipitous searching, which is kind of that haphazard way and being okay with that. And so it really is combining different methods to best answer the question. And so it's this idea of a flexible yet systematic review. And my favorite quote right now that I've been using often is from F. Scott Fitzgerald. And he says, "The test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in the mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function." And that's kind of what I do with systematic reviews, that, you know, this idea that they're systematic yet flexible, and those seem to contradict each other. But if you're able to balance those, I think they end up producing something that's really useful and really lets you adapt to what you need. And so I just wanted to thank Marika and our lab for helping put the presentation together. I've included citations for the For the guidebooks that I use most frequently, the ones I had on the screen there, and then thanks to our photo and image credits. And so, Christina, I didn't know, Nicole, if you wanted to add anything, or if we're saving questions for later. Is that correct?
We do have time for one clarifying question as we switch over to our next presenters. So if anyone in our, or if Nicole, if you have something you'd like to add, feel free to jump in now. But as we begin to shift over to our next group, we can take maybe one clarifying question.
I just had a couple of very quick things I wanted to add, and then I'll turn it over also for if there's a clarifying question. But first, I wanted to say thanks, Alison. She is the master in charge of these approaches here from our side. And the only things I want to add, I have little to really boost that, but because we're doing a couple of different reviews right now, it always occurs to me the importance of that very first step that Alison was emphasizing, the definition piece and the research question piece. And with that, many of you will be involved in this right now. You've gotten some documents where we've asked for input. I know different people are involved in different ways for this project, but I think that you can't emphasize enough the importance of having advisors at that step. And it's partially because people are really interested often in these reviews. And the challenge is that when you have advisors at different stages, it can get messy. As you see when you go through, it's harder to have advisors at some stages than others. But that beginning part, it's wonderful to have advisors, and it's wonderful to get feedback. And so that's where we worked really hard to see where are the best places to get input from different people. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. The other thing I wanted to mention was the importance of documenting every single step, because you think you will never, just with any kind of research and dissertations or anything, you think you will never forget what you did. And because there are so many steps, you actually can forget it pretty quickly as you move through, especially with each decision point. And so we try to keep a running blog or running Google Doc that documents everything, so that when we go to write up an article, even though the article might not want to know every little bit and piece that we did, we have it at least for ourselves. And as part of that, the importance of teamwork and communication, so that everyone on the team knows where we are and exactly what we're doing, so that we don't have to go back and retrace our steps. And then the last thing that I will mention as well is just the importance of the things that I wish I'd known that I didn't know before, which Alison mentioned, for example, databases. The difference among all the databases, we've really relied heavily on our reference librarians at the university. They've been incredibly helpful because these databases are constantly changing. And so just emphasizing that there are people who do this professionally all the time, and there are so many people out there who have opinions that are outside of our own field. So that was the last piece I wanted to note in that it is helpful to have people who aren't as invested in these topics as we are. And so we found that to be very helpful, to be able to ask questions of people who really have no tie to the topics, but who can give you less biased or more objective input at various stages, especially, for example, when choosing the databases, et cetera.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, both of you. I think we'll now switch over to our next presenters. But just to reiterate to the folks on the call today that, in the last week, I think we have sent out materials to our working groups, to our different working groups for feedback on many of our materials. And so this is a great time to provide some of those inputs on some of our literature review methods and scope. So this is the perfect time. So thank you so much, Nicole and Alison. And now we're going to turn things over to Heila. Heila?
Thank you very much, Christina, and thanks, Nicole and Alison. Lovely presentation, and I sort of planned mine to kind of link to yours, so I hope it does. And Ludwig is joining me in the presentation. Ludwig, could you put our presentation up, if that's okay? Sorry, I had a problem with putting the presentation up. So Ludwig will run the presentation for me. And just to mention that here at Rhodes University in South Africa, we are a team of about 10 people working on this project. So we're just representing the rest of our team. My colleague Eureka and Rob and others are on the call, and a number of our graduate scholars as well have joined us this evening. So all the names you didn't know, Christina, some of them are ours. So welcome, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I wanted to talk a little bit about knowledge synthesis work, a little bit sort of what it is, what we can do with it, what we can't do with it and how to potentially resolve that. So that's kind of a little bit where I want to speak with this presentation. You can move. Thanks, Ludwig. Yeah, so I think Nicole and Alison have covered, there's so many definitions actually of knowledge synthesis, but I like this one because it talks about contextualization and integration of research findings of individual studies within the larger body of knowledge on the topic. And I'll come back to the issue of contextualization a little bit later as we go through. Thanks, Ludwig. You can move on. Yeah, so I think the main focus with this kind of work is really focusing on reviewing, and that's different to some of the other types of research that we do, as Nicola has also said, and as Alison has also said, sorry, to review existing evidence and to have this explicit method that you work quite carefully on. And what it does is it gives us a carefully constructed picture of the dominant thinking about a particular topic and therefore can facilitate our navigating of the literature. And I want to come back to the issue of the dominant thinking as well as we go on. And then as Alison mentioned, the origins of this type of work, or especially knowledge synthesis work, comes mainly from the medical sciences, and I'll talk a bit about that as well as we go forward. And the point there is to move away from reliance on eminence and experience-based opinion or individual studies so that you can get a more holistic and integrated view of the best available evidence. And of course, that's super important for medical science, as we are seeing also currently in the COVID-19 pandemic. But you can move on. Thanks, Ludwig. So this point that I was making now is that the sort of origins and history of this kind of reviewing work comes out of the biomedical sciences, where there is a need for generalizable evidence of empirical results. And we see that, just all of this work that's going on at the moment around vaccine is a very, very good example of why on earth we need that. And it's been so interesting to see the rapid way in which these coalitions of scientists have been forming around doing this kind of, evidence-based comparative work in order to get strength in their insights and findings in this particular type of work. But of course, as Alison also said, this is used in other scholarly fields, and here it becomes more complicated, and especially in the social sciences. And because what happens there is that we always we can only really ever offer a vantage point or a perspective on a field, and that can be either theoretical or contextual. And in our case with the MECCE project, we're trying to do regional and contextual, and that has its own particular challenges compared to theoretical. And I'll talk a bit into that as well as I go on. So this is very complex because many perspectives are possible. And even though we think we're being systematic and objective, we're still bringing perspectives. And there's always more to the social world than empirical analysis. So there's always more to what there is to say about the social world than what we can find in research findings, no matter how rigorous they are. So these are the things that make it slightly more complicated in the social sciences. Thanks, Ludwig. You can move on. Move, Ludwig. Yeah, so I wanted to just show this example. It's a study that we did a few years ago because we were trying to understand, social learning. And what we decided to do was to do this work of different perspectives. So we had one group that took the topic from the perspective of the natural resource management scientists and did a very kind of careful systematic review of how they were thinking about social learning. And then we had another group that were, more interested in development and action type of engagement in the world. And they did a similar type of thing. And then we from the learning sciences decided to take educational and theoretical concepts and to delineate our reviews like that. And it was so interesting because we got three completely different views of the same particular phenomenon. So this is a very good example of, how in the social sciences, depending on where you come from and how you delineate what you're looking, it gives you a particular view on something. So actually, in the end, we need these multiple perspectives coming from these different vantage points in order to get a fuller perspective on a particular area of study. Thanks, Ludwig. Move on. Yes, and then we recently did another one where we were looking at this transformative social learning on the path to 1.5 degrees with Tom and Aryan and a couple of other colleagues. And what we decided to do there was to look at climate change education from a science-orientated perspective, from a policy-orientated perspective, from an organization and management perspective, and transformation perspective. And it's so interesting when you take these vantage points and you start to look at the whole, then you start to get a more comprehensive view on the phenomenon that you're looking at. So if you only chose one particular vantage point, you would get a limited view on the whole. And of course, our views are constantly limited because we can never incorporate all of the different dimensions of the social world and the complexity of social life when we're dealing with complex issues like climate change or climate change education. So I think this is why we need teams of 10 and more than one university and big projects like MECCE to get a good grasp on these kinds of questions. Thanks, Ludwig. You can move on. So there are different types, as Alison has already said. And she also said it's very important to know, the criteria you're using, how they're constructed, why they're constructed in that way, and also how they relate to the questions being asked. And then also what I want to point out is what they can and what they can't do. And I feel this is quite important. Thanks, Ludwig. You can move on. Yes, because there are critiques also of systematic reviews. And the one that I like, whether I first got interested actually in systematic reviews was through this particular critique. And what Sue Clegg was doing was she was saying that, one of the problems is that they tend to focus themselves too much on the notion of evidence. And what we then end up with is valorizing a particular gold standard of a particular type of evidence, of course, and that comes out of the biomedical sciences and being transposed across into the social sciences. And so she makes the point that we could end up, having arguments about methods, and those become the proxy for examining ontological and epistemological assumptions in the world. And it can reduce and constrain scholarship that is oriented to critique and emancipation. And this is the issue that I've tried to take up as we've tried to continue to work with systematic review. So we've worked more with critical realism as a way of coming to systematic review work, building on this earlier work of Sue. And what she does is she tries to say that we can work with evidence and what we find from evidence, but then we also need to link that to proper theoretical argumentation. And we also need to look at it in terms of the ontological dynamics of the world. And so it asks a different kind of question, you see. Instead of what works discourse, it starts to ask a question about what works for whom, under what conditions, and what is absent and what needs to be transformed. So it asks a different kind of question as we work with this evidence that we are accumulating and generalizing and pulling together from the range of scholarly works that we're looking at. So it disrupts this notion of cumulative generalization. And I think that that's also very, very important, and that we can't reduce the ontological reality to evidence-based findings. In other words, we can't reduce ontology to empiricism. Otherwise, we just fall back into the trap of positivism, which was the major problem with positivism. Thanks, Ludwig. Move on quickly. Sorry. So we've also been looking at what critical realism can offer to this kind of work. It offers more, I think, than just exposing the real dynamics and mechanisms that shape your empirical understandings. Thanks, Ludwig. Move on. And what I've become very interested in is how it can help us to deal with this particular problem, which I think is a major Achilles heel of knowledge synthesis studies. And that is the fact that, I think, Alison, you also mentioned it from that science study, that the majority of science and so-called science is being produced, there. You can look at it. And so what does that say, actually, when the majority of the world's people, actually, many of them are living, south of that big bubble? What does it say then about the knowledge that we are synthesizing, and what conclusions can we actually make when we're talking about knowledge synthesis? So there's a big absence and a gap and a big issue that we need to open up around knowledge synthesis work. And this is what we're trying to do also as we move in our MECCE analysis. And I'll touch on it very briefly, the methodology that we're trying to work with, and then hand over to Ludwig. Ludwig, you can carry on.
Heila, just a note, if you could speed through this section, just so that we can get to Ludwig and have some Q&A. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Christina. So we're working with this particular piece of work, which I really like. It's a piece of work written by Okoli, and it's called Theory Mining Reviews. And he tries to develop systematic review in a particular way that sort of opens up this relationship between the systematic review, the theory development, and the ontological dynamic. So you can move on, Ludwig. I'll just touch on it very quickly just to show you. And he gives us like 3 layers to this methodology. So he talks about to scope out the theoretical landscape, what is known, as I showed you in that one example, with the different perspectives, and then to look for a new, to contend for a new theoretical model where you look for relations between key concepts. For example, you can look for the relationship between climate change education and quality education in this particular case. They're different concepts, they've got different roots, and you need to understand the connection between them. And then what you can do is develop a hypothesis or a theory, and then you can test that hypothesis with empirical work from different places and spaces, so different case studies. And the little diagrams I've got here is some of the work we were doing in the T-Learning project, where you can then test your hypothesis in different places, and you can then get a more robust, ontologically conversational way of thinking about your knowledge synthesis work. Can you just move on quickly, Ludwig? Sorry, I don't like not being able to move my own slides. So he kind of gives us this way of thinking about, you know, explanatory. The first level gives you a sort of explanatory approach. And then the next level gives you a way of arguing theoretical relationships in relation to what you find from the evidence. And then you can have another process which allows you to then confirm, to test its validity seeking and ontological groundedness to your knowledge synthesis work. Thanks, Ludwig. You can move on. Yeah, so now I'll hand over to Ludwig, and he'll just share quickly with you how we're starting to do some of this work in the our knowledge synthesis. Okay, Ludwig, over to you. Ludwig, do you want to unmute? Ludwig, you muted? You there, Ludwig?
Yes, all right.
There we go.
All right, okay.
Now we can hear you.
Okay, now?
Yep, go for it.
All right. Okay, so I'm presenting on our practical experience with the knowledge synthesis review. I will look at the basics of what we are doing. I will look at the process of what we are doing, and I also present on the results that we are getting so far. So as MECCE Axis 1, looking at the knowledge synthesis review, our particular contribution is going to explore how cultural and regional factors might influence what constitutes to be quality, climate change, education, and communication. So adopting Okoli, as has been mentioned earlier, we are taking a form of theory mining review, looking at the cultural and regional dynamics, shaping contextual understanding of quality, climate change, education, and communication. So the key driving questions in our task include for us to look at the features and the concepts that are coming up in the papers that we are reviewing. So when you talk about the concepts and the features, we are looking at things, the concepts that are related to climate change education or climate change communication or climate change learning. We also look at the relationship that exists between these concepts. If it's climate change adaptation or resilience, how do they relate to each other for us to in the papers that we are reviewing? Okay, we also look at the methods and the processes that are being proposed in the papers on how to deal with the challenges that have been mentioned in the papers that are actually affecting the quality or the quantity of climate change education. We also look at the key debates and challenges that are arising in these papers. What are they talking about? What are the challenges? What's there that is stopping for us to have like a broad and quality and a broad quality climate change education? So I will present on how we are doing this. So the key feature of our process is to really know what you're looking for, because when you know what you're looking for, then the search actually becomes an adventure. So things that we considered when we were coming up on how we can do with this task included the database to use. We using Google Scholar, which we found to be more accessible and easy in terms of connectivity as well. We've come up with the key terms. What are the key terms that we're looking for? We suggest we go back and forth. Sometimes you come up with a term that really is not so much connected to what you are really looking for. We demarcated the regions. What are the regions, who works on what regions, and what are they looking for? So if you look at the second point now, this is our search protocol. We put review, and then we mention the region that we're looking for. We on this, if you look at the screenshot to the right, you see that that's a screenshot from our Google Scholar. On top, we do review Europe, depending on what you're looking for. If it's Europe or America, just have to replace there. Then we look at the climate change education, climate change learning, climate change communication. So our papers, we're looking at the papers, documents from 2015 to 2020. But the challenge is that some of the UNSDG regions, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals regions that we have, sometimes they don't really bring out the results that we want because they don't represent the regions that we traditionally know. So we have to end up splitting the regions themselves, and then having to mention the countries so that you actually pinpoint to the countries that we're looking for that fall within a certain region. So because sometimes you won't get enough of what you're looking for, you end up having to do additional searches to complement the number of documents that you need. So this process is actually an iterative process of that you, as I mentioned earlier on, that you have to go back and forth. So we have one person that's me who actually moves from one region to another, sort of as a triangulation of the process. So you go and check what your colleagues are doing. If you find any inconsistencies, then you have to report on them. Yes. So for some regions, for UNSDG, we find that Latin America and the Caribbean, they're grouped together. But if you find that there's if you group them together and you search them in the search terms as one region, there's an imbalance that Latin America actually dominates the results that you get. So we have to end up actually splitting the region. Say if we're looking for 200 papers, then because Latin America is bigger than the Caribbean from what we're seeing, then we have to get maybe 150 from Latin America and then 50 from the Caribbean. But this is always debatable. We go back and forth. As I said, it's an iterative process. So yeah, move to the next one. Yeah, so I'll now present on the early insights that we are getting now. We are starting to find out, as we are moving to level 2 now, we're starting to find out that the regions, the countries within one region, they share a lot in common in terms of what we're finding out. We found out sub-Saharan Africa, there's a strong emphasis on indigenous knowledge system, and there's also a strong emphasis on how this indigenous knowledge system interfaces with the Western knowledge. As mentioned earlier, that we are looking at the regional and the cultural the context of the quality of climate change education. On the regional emphasis, we're finding that some regions, for example, if you look at the Western Africa, which is part of the sub-Saharan Africa, we find that there's a high concentration of researches that were done on smallholder farmers. But this really didn't come as a surprise because we know that in sub-Saharan Africa we have like 333 million small-scale farmers who contribute about 90% of what we eat in sub-Saharan Africa. So yeah, and then we look at the cultural emphasis also on the regions. We find that, as I mentioned earlier, that some regions, they emphasize on the indigenous knowledge system, but others are quiet. Also interesting coming out from research, as mentioned as one of the critique of the knowledge synthesis review, is that in Asia, most of the documents or papers that were coming across were written by English academics who have got the Western bias. Yes, and also we're also assuming that it might also be an issue of what I would call what is normally known as the helicopter research, where you have researchers who come in without enough information, without enough insider perspective for them to bring out an objective as the research output that reflects what is on the ground. Yes, that's all for me.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ludwig. I was just about to chime in to say we should move to the Q&A. Thank you so much, Ludwig and Heila, for bringing to bear some of the the conceptual issues and the issues of bias in systematic review or in literature reviews, and how we might be able to approach it in a way where we draw out some of those contextualizations. So I think we want to open up the floor to some questions and answers. There is a raise hand button. You can also feel free to put your questions in the chat box, and I will call your name and ask for you to unmute your microphone so you can ask your question. But I need to figure out how to find you. Let me just show my participants here. I see that you're raising hands, but I cannot. Okay, here we go. Erin, you have your hand up if you want to go first and then ask your question.
Sure. Thanks so much to both the presenters, all the presenters. Really interesting material, so informative, and really appreciate that taking the time to kind of keep us informed. I have 3 questions that I just want to raise quickly. And get some idea, different kinds of responses. One, and maybe this speaks to a little bit the issue that Heila raised in her presentation, is that, to the extent that, we see this imbalance in terms of the literature that's being reviewed, that much of it is being published and visible in global North countries, and so little of it is being kind of created and published in global South countries. And so, in some sense, we want to address this imbalance. Having said that, I guess you could make an argument that some of the worst, polluters or contributors to, the climate crisis is really in the global North, and that in some sense, the literature of the global North, created by the global North, would be more relevant in some ways. Obviously, it has to do a little bit about, maybe which aspects we look at adaptation mitigation. So I wonder if that's something that we should also keep in mind, potentially, is that issue. And I'd like to ask a question of, what do, and this would be for either of the presenters, like, could you consider what might be the unintended consequences of the systematic reviews that we might do? In other words, where might we get it wrong, and how might what we get wrong, really lead us down a very problematic path, or potentially bias, some work that we would in other words, is there a way for us to highlight that? And the third point is more technical, and it has to do with kind of using the term, the UN SDG regional classification as some primordial thing that is enormously useful. This is a very recent construction, and it's very political. And how the international community kind of classifies countries has evolved over time. I actually think that most academics, a lot of them publish, would not necessarily be cognizant or even realize some of these classifications. So things that are more, let's say, popular, like sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, or Asia, I would stick to regional terms that probably are much more prevalent in the literature among academics, and that aren't necessarily legitimized through the UN SDG system. And I realize that the review is focusing on the post-2015 period, which might mean that maybe it's given that you might, if you're going to find it, you're going to find it in the recent years. But it's a real political construction, and I don't think that a lot of academics that are publishing articles in this area would necessarily embrace it, but would find it fairly convoluted and problematic.
Thank you, Erin. Before we let our presenters respond, maybe we can also get Dan's question, just so that we have all the questions out there, and then we can have responses from the presenters all together. Dan, would you like to unmute your microphone and ask your question, please? Or Don, sorry, I'm B-U-I-J-S.
Yeah, here am
Okay.
I.
Okay, thank you.
Dan, yeah,
Okay.
in Dutch. Yeah, thanks so much for the contributions. My question is about how to do a literature review on a concept that is not yet very much done research on. my own research is on living the questions, and this concept is actually, on the one hand, really old. Already Socrates did some work on it, and on the other hand, it's not very much used in science. So I find it really difficult to do a good literature research on this topic.
Great, thank you so much. All right, Alison, Heila, Ludwig, and Nicole, if you're still in line, any of you would like to take question around this intersection of biases and emissions, and biases in the literature versus, regions in the world that have the greatest emissions, unintended consequences, our classification of regions, and then literature reviews on concepts not yet researched.
I'm
Nicole,
guessing that all of us have good things to say. I have a couple of just quick thoughts. Maybe I'll put them in very quickly and then let others respond. Those are such great questions. Maybe I'll just respond to the one about problems. So this is Aaron's second question. It's such a great question, and it's something certainly we think about a lot, especially when you're trying to pull together research from a lot of different areas and being careful about how you represent the research, which I think Heila made this point very nicely. One of the things that I think about a lot, and our group thinks about a lot, when you're not doing a systematic review, or when you're not doing a review, but just pulling research into a paper or research otherwise, what can happen is you go back to studies over and over again that may be ones that you're citing not because they're the best or most appropriate for your work, but because they're the ones that are used most often. And what I find helpful about reviews is that they do tend to gather a broader swath of the literature. And so what it can do is it can highlight papers that are somewhat obscure or that you may not find otherwise. And so it can bring together a bigger grouping of literature than you may see otherwise. So that's something I think that can happen. Of course, one of the challenges is that you are putting a statement out there, and as Heila really emphasized, nothing is values free. So you're always putting some kind of values judgment on it. I think there's a lot more to be said about that. That's all that I'll mention on that for right now. And then I just also wanted to touch on that last point that was just made, which I think was also a fantastic question. I think many of us are researching in areas where there's not a lot yet. And that's an exciting opportunity to try to think about what are some orthogonal or some concepts that are around the concept that I'm researching, and how might I construct a question that gets at some of the points that are part of this. And this, I think, gets back to the first point that Alison was making around when you construct your research question. How do I think about research questions that would kind of triangulate toward the area that I'm interested in? And I'll stop there so that others can respond. I know they have a lot to say as well.
I can jump in for a minute. I'll keep them quick to give Heila time, and Ludwig if he wants it. And to recall with the bias, yes, it's an excellent question. I think that sometimes that can be something that is overspun for systematic reviews. People think, oh, they're so unbiased, but I think you absolutely have to be clear about what you think the biases are, and have your limitations section and talk about that. I know we've struggled with that within our team. We may have some people who are bilingual, trilingual, multiple languages, but may not be comfortable with the language enough to translate. And so that's always kind of one of our limitations, is saying we have only focused on the English speaking, the English publications written in English. But I think what's interesting now is Google Translate actually comes to be good. Like, we had an article the other day come up in Spanish, we put it in Google Translate, and it was able to translate pretty good. Now, was I comfortable enough including that? I don't know the true level of the translation. So there's all kind of issues that come up with that. But just, I think my one point is to be clear about your biases. And if you read a review that says it's completely bias-free, that should raise a red flag. I thought Don's question was excellent about looking at a new field too. I know systematic mapping may be a good tool to use. And so that's often done in an exploratory kind of review. And that can, if you do it in a systematic way, it may show you new areas you haven't looked at yet. And then that's also helpful for others who are interested in the same topic, because then you provide a map of the literature for other folks. And so that map, a systematic map or a mapping review, could be a really useful tool.
Great. Thank you so much, Alison. I know Heila was having some audio issues, but I don't know if Ludwig or Heila, if you want to add in any thoughts or comments on the questions.
So on the issue.
Yeah, I can try to come in. I don't know. Can you hear me, Christina?
Yes, we can hear you. I didn't know if Ludwig also wanted to speak too, but yes, we can hear you. Maybe Ludwig, while Heila's sound is coming in and out, if you want to go.
Yes, I wanted to go on the issue of to do with the issues to do with the original issue, the UNSDG issue. So doing that, that's
one second, Ludwig. Heila, could you put your microphone on mute for a second? We can hear your typing. Thank you. Okay, Ludwig, go ahead.
Okay, so on the issue to do with the challenges that we about having to use the UNSDG regions. Yes, indeed, we actually picked that, but we don't have much scholars that use the UNSDG regions. So what we are doing is that we are also going in to look for supplementary publications, be it lay literature from projects and programs that have been completed in the region. And we also are going to use other search engines. And also, because we've got people who are working in different regions, sometimes a paper from a certain region pops up in another region, so you just have to flag it and share with others. To go on the issue of the challenges that you might face, the challenge to avoid the challenges that that are associated with knowledge synthesis, the search protocol, is that you have to have search terms that directly speak to what you are looking for. Because the moment you get something wrong, it happened in our situation. The moment you get to include a word that shouldn't be there, then it ends up having to give you like totally different results. So your search protocol should be consistent and strict.
Great. Thank you, Ludwig. And Heila writes in her comments that in terms of Aaron's point about the literature review and the carbon emissions, that there is a huge need to support climate change adaptations, for example, an emphasis on smallholder farmers in Africa, just to ensure that we are getting good representation in terms of the issues. So we have maybe one more. Oh, and I see Eureka has also commented that African countries also need to be aware of the ways in which they could contribute to climate change. There is a lot of pressure to industrialize. Zambia is the third biggest contributor to greenhouse gases in Africa due to destruction of forests and charcoal production of energy purposes. So thank you for your responses in the chat, Heila and Eureka, and thank you, Ludwig, Nicole, and Alison. If we don't have any, I don't leave maybe the last minute to see if anybody else has any questions. You can raise your hand or you can feel free to unmute. No further questions. Okay, then, well, we want to thank everyone for joining us today. Oh, we have one question from Dominique. Dominique, do you want to try to unmute?
Hi guys, sorry for joining late. I had problems with my speakers. During the Asia Literature Review has been a really interesting road. I do have lots to contribute to this discussion, but as I was telling Ingrid earlier, I think I'm just going to give it a few more days until I bite my teeth further into the literature that I have, and I'm going to have lots more to contribute, I promise you. It's been a really interesting journey.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dominique. Okay, well then with that, thank you all for joining us in our first of our series. We look forward to seeing you all as we continue this. I think our next one is in January. We will send you all further details of that. And you all have, those of you who are within our working groups, you have charging orders in terms of what to review and what to provide feedback on in the next couple of days. So we look forward to hearing from you that way, or and see you at our next webinar. So thank you so much.
Thanks everybody. Sorry my sound and everything went just during questions.
That's all right. That's all right. Thank you everyone.
Thanks Christina. Thanks Aaron.
Thank you to our presenters. Thank you everyone. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.